What's up guys, how's it going? Gleb here, and today I wanted to talk about the camera that I've been using for the past 3 or so years, my trusty Nikon D750. Let's talk about it. So you're probably wondering why I'm talking about a 5-year-old DSLR when pretty much everything is headed towards mirrorless. Well, that's because I still think this is a fantastic camera, especially for those of you that already have Nikon glass and want a second body or upgrade to a full frame. These are great for what they offer, especially if you're shooting stills. For video, not so much. We'll get to that in a minute. However, for stills, this is a great second body or just a great all-around camera. So let me tell you why I think that. So real quick, let's go over some of the basic specs. The camera has a 24 megapixel sensor, has an ISO range between 100 and 12,800, 51 autofocus points, about 6.5 FPS burst rate, and full HD video at up to 60 frames per second. All of that was pretty standard for, 5 years ago, and it still holds up pretty well today. Not so much on the video side, but videos hasn't always been Nikon's strong suit until their recent releases like the Nikon Z6 and the Nikon Z7. So this camera, I'm going to primarily talk about what it can do for stills photography versus video. I will touch up on video a little bit, but we'll primarily focus on stills. So now that you know the specs, let's jump into the image quality, starting with the stills. The image quality when it comes to stills on this camera I think is excellent. I mean, obviously you're not getting the super high resolution sensor that you would get from the Nikon D810 or the newer Nikon D850, the Nikon Z7, or for example the Sony A7R III or the A7R II. It's a 24 megapixel sensor, so it's not going to give you this super high resolution, super sharp image. So with that being said, I think 24 megapixels is a really good image size, and that's probably why a lot of manufacturers still continue to offer a 24 megapixel body in addition to some high resolution body. You can see that from all the brands that I just listed, as well as the new Panasonic mirrorless cameras, full frame mirrorless cameras that were just released. So you usually have the 24 megapixel and then some kind of 45-ish, 50-ish megapixel sensor camera. So like I said, the 24 megapixel size is, I think, just a super versatile size. Your file sizes aren't too big, however they're big enough if you want to make a larger print, and they don't take up as much storage on your computer or memory card. But what I really love about this camera's image quality is the dynamic range. The dynamic range on this 5-year-old camera is excellent. You can really underexpose the scene, or you can really expose for the highlights and then really pull those shadows up and get a lot of detail back. It works great for me because I shoot a lot of landscape photography. It's what I enjoy doing. So when you're shooting into that nice beautiful sunset or sunrise, and then you want to expose for the sky so you get those beautiful sky colors, and then pull up the shadows so you can still see what's going on in the foreground or just on the ground in general, this camera lets you push it pretty far with minimal noise, especially when you're shooting at 100 ISO. But even then, at high ISO, when you're shooting at higher ISO, the performance on this camera is really good. I've shot weddings with it, I've shot events with it, I've shot landscapes with it, and even at higher ISOs, I was always impressed with this camera's control of the noise and noise quality. So basically, the images just look clean unless you crank up the ISO super high. I always thought the images came out looking very clean even at higher ISOs. I'm also a pretty big fan of the colors that this camera puts out. It's not quite as good as the newer Nikon bodies like the D850 or the new mirrorless cameras, because they change their algorithm all the time. They change the way the camera processes the images, and usually the newer generations will have better color rendition, especially when you're shooting in JPEG or you're just using the built-in camera profiles. However, with RAWs, I always found that this camera had really good image quality. I don't usually have to do a lot of color correcting or adjustments and color and anything like that, because I just think they look good the way they come out. Obviously I shoot RAW, so there's a lot of flexibility in what I can do and what I can accomplish and how I can make it look. However, even when shooting JPEGs, this camera still delivers pretty good images. So Now that we got the image quality for stills out of the way, let's talk a little bit about the video quality. And back when this camera came out, Nikon wasn't really pushing video as hard. Obviously it still has full HD at up to 60 frames per second. However, compared to what you would get from newer cameras, especially from newer Nikon cameras or from cameras from other manufacturers, the video quality is okay. That's the whole reason why I picked up a GH5. That's my primary video camera, and I just use that mainly for stills. However, I've shot video on the D750 before, and I always thought, you know, it was fine. It didn't have zebra stripes, it didn't have focus peaking or anything like that. And the image quality for video looked okay. It was sharp enough, it looked pretty good, the colors were okay, and it did have its nice flat profile, so it gave you a little bit room in post to color correct if you need to. However, you know, it was just okay. And unlike the stills quality, when you crank up the ISO in video, you do tend to get a lot more noise than what I've seen from, you know, using Canons before, or using Sony cameras. It's just doesn't handle high ISO very well when shooting video. However, if you need video in a pinch, or if that's the only camera you have and you want to shoot video, go right ahead, because it still works really well. And sometimes you just have to make do with what you have. And, you know, if once you learn how to use a product good enough, then you can really produce some awesome stuff with it, no matter what kind of camera it is. So let's move on to the performance of the camera. Now let's say the performance of this camera is fine. Obviously, it's not an action camera, it's not a sports camera. It doesn't shoot 12 frames per second like the Nikon D5 or the Canon 1DX Mark II. It doesn't shoot the super high resolution files like, you know, the Nikon D850 or the Sony A7R III. However, the performance is still good. I've always enjoyed using the camera. It never kind of hicked up or froze up on me or anything like that. Pretty much as soon as I flick it on, it's always just ready to go. Like, I'm ready to shoot as soon as I flip the on switch. It's good to go, and it just performs really well. And at 6.5 frames per second shooting, it does an okay job. Even if you want to grab some action shots, or if you're shooting events and you gotta, you know, shoot a little burst or two in there just so you can get the right kind of picture, or so you can have different exposures to work with, and then pick out the best one. So yeah, it performs really well. And the other thing I love about this camera when it comes to performance is the autofocus. It has 51 autofocus points, and it has Nikon's awesome 3D tracking system, where you basically just grab the autofocus point and it will track your subject around the whole autofocus point frame, and as you're shooting pictures. It works really well, and it's an awesome system. My only real complaint about the autofocus is that the autofocus points are centered more towards the center of the frame, so the outside edges of the frame really kind of get left out, so you sometimes do have to do the whole focus and recompose route. And that's, I guess, the advantage that you just get from the newer mirrorless cameras, because they can have autofocus that goes all the way up to the edges. Can't really get that in all the DSLRs, especially not in this one. So it's just something to consider and keep in mind if you are planning on buying this camera, or if you're just curious about it. However, the autofocus performance itself is excellent. It performs really well even in lower light, and when you're shooting in bright sunlight or in just really good lighting, the autofocus is quick, it's snappy, and it's pretty accurate. And like I said, that tracking system is awesome. So while the autofocus may be great when you're shooting stills, for video, unfortunately, I wouldn't use autofocus on the Nikon D750 unless you're just shooting a stationary subject and you just need to focus once. However, if you're planning on tracking that subject, or it's going to be moving back and forth throughout the frame, or just anywhere, pretty much any kind of continuous autofocus situation, I would avoid using it. The Nikon D750 uses the older contrast detect autofocus system, and you do get a lot of hunting. It just goes back and forth and doesn't really stick to the subject like you would get from, you know, more modern cameras. So if you're planning on shooting video with a Nikon D750, I just recommend sticking to manual focus, because the autofocus is kind of useless. So shifting away from autofocus a little bit, my other only gripe with the performance of this camera is the buffer size. So I can get about 12 RAW files into the buffer before, you know, it fills up and needs to write it to the card. So when you're shooting those bursts, you really don't have a lot of room to shoot, and it doesn't clear super fast. Even using faster SD cards in it, it takes a minute to clear the buffer, and really that's the only other complaint I have about the performance of the camera is that small buffer size. So like I said, if you are shooting events or action shots, that's just something to consider. So moving on from the performance, let's talk about the handling of the camera. And this is where I think the DSLRs still shine over a lot of the mirrorless bodies out there. They do have the bulk and the size. They're a little bit bigger, they're a little bit bulkier. However, the grip on this camera is excellent. It fits my hand perfectly. All the buttons are within the reach. I can even shoot this pretty much with my right hand if I needed to, because everything I need to is just right there. And that's what I really love about DSLRs still compared to mirrorless cameras. A lot of mirrorless cameras have gotten better. I've played around with the Nikon Z6 and the Z7. The grips on those are pretty excellent. The new 3rd generation Sony mirrorless cameras are doing really good. Or for example, the new Panasonic cameras. Those cameras have huge bodies with very large grips, so it still feels pretty well, especially paired with a heavier lens. However, this traditional DSLR body, it just works. It just works really well. They can fit a lot of buttons on here, and they can fit a deeper grip and make it super comfortable to hold and to use for long periods of time. And like I mentioned, pretty much I think the button placement and just where everything is located on the body of the camera is in a good place within easy reach. Plus you get the nice little tilty screen, so if you are using live view to shoot a subject, maybe some landscapes, so you don't have to always bend over and look through the viewfinder, you do have the tilty screen to look through, which is a really nice addition. And I pretty much love any camera that has a movable screen. Although a flippy screen like on the GH5 is my favorite, the tilt is, acceptable. It's acceptable. Unfortunately, it is not a touch screen. They didn't have touchscreen cameras back then, at least not as many. So that is something that I really love using on my GH5 or some of the newer cameras, but D750 unfortunately doesn't have that, which is fine. The navigating the menus is still pretty easy. There's standard Nikon layout, so you just scroll through the whole list and pretty much pick out what you need. So really easy to get through the camera, really easy to configure it, and just really easy to use, especially if you're a Nikon user. You can pick up this camera and just start shooting right away without having to figure out where each different button is. It's a really good setup, and it's really easy and comfortable to use. And just real quick before I forget, and just real quick because I almost forgot to mention this, that camera does have dual card slots. And that's one of the reasons why I think it makes for a great events camera, is because, if you're shooting an event, you don't want to accidentally lose your shot. So if you misplace your memory card, or if it corrupts or something goes wrong with it, you always have a backup. And this camera lets you write to both memory cards at the same time, so you always have a backup within the camera of the event you're shooting. It really helps if it's an important event, and if you are paranoid about losing your data or your card being corrupted, it's always nice to have that extra card slot to back up to. Alright, so in conclusion, the Nikon D750, even though it's 5 years old, still holds up really well against the current cameras on the market. And if you're looking for a full frame camera, it's a great option to consider, especially if you're just shooting stills. And like I said, this camera is just all around a great versatile camera because it can shoot in a variety of different situations, whether you're shooting weddings, events, landscapes, portraits, product photography. It has the resolution, the image quality, and the performance to kind of handle all of those situations. Kind of a good jack of all trades. So with all that being said, that concludes my review or talk about the Nikon D750. It's still a great camera, and I still love using it, and I'll probably hang on to it for a little bit longer. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I hope you found it informative. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns, leave them down in the comments below. Also, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share with your friends if they might be interested in purchasing this camera, or if they're just interested in cameras in general. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys next time.